Hey everyone, this is Curb Knight, and today I'm going to be bringing you a deck profile for Flamme-Glam. Alright, so for the Flamme-Glam deck, as always, I'm going to go ahead and talk about how it does in the meta. I do actually think that Flamme-Glam, unironically, is kind of a sleeper deck. Like, I will definitely say that it's not at the power level we're currently at in the meta. In comparison to some of the other decks I play, this deck is probably much better and has a much better chance in the meta as opposed to some of those other decks. But that being said, I still think that the deck is lacking just a little bit more. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and hop straight into the deck profile. So as always, we are going to be starting off with the ride line, which is actually kind of important. Of course, we are going to be starting off with our Vanguard, which is Blue Crea. You do actually have to play her in as your main starter for reasons that will become very apparent very soon. Now, of course, we do have the grade 1, which is when she's rode upon by the grade 2, you choose a Flamme-Glam from your soul. Basically, you choose the starter, and then you call both her and her out. So you create a free 14k column, but at the end of the turn, both of them do get put back into the soul, because you do actually need this to stay in the soul. Now, you don't actually have to create that 14k column. You can do a bunch of other cheeky things. Like some things I do is calling this out to 1, give it a booster, and then call this behind the Vanguard to just get that extra pressure. But yeah, just the actual placement for her skill is it's more varied than you would like initially think. But we'll go ahead and go over her other skill once we talk about the copies in the main deck, because of course we do actually have to play copies in the main deck. But the grade 2, when she's ridden over by the grade 3 Flamme-Glam, you can draw 2 cards, and then you choose 1 card from your hand and put it at the bottom of your deck. So this is a very helpful way if you happen to draw anything like heal triggers, like I am very much known to do. You can easily just put them back to the bottom of the deck, and this deck has a plethora of ways to actually shuffle, so there's a pretty good chance that you're just going to be able to see it, hopefully, during the game. Now, of course, we do have our main Vanguard here, of course, that being the Flamme-Glam Regia. She does have the act once per turn, Soul Blast 1. You choose a Flamme-Glam that's grade 2 or less, and you call it from either the deck or the soul. And then, of course, you search the deck, you do, of course, shuffle. So basically just like a little Luhan skill there, if anyone remembers that deck. There's another deck that I haven't touched in forever. So the main skill that Regina has is that at the battle she attacks, if you have 3 or more differently named Flamme-Glam units, you can counterblast when to superior ride the grade 0 on top. Now she's going to be losing that 1 auto ability she has, so you don't get to draw a card even if you went second. But the other effect is that she gets 2k power for every card in both players' damage zones. So once you get later into the game, the grade 0 does actually get very, very big, especially with combining her with a bunch of other effects. Now, when you do actually rewrite into her from the grade 0, it doesn't actually have to be from soul, which is like a very V thing to think. You can actually write it from drop, which means that this is technically an infinite soul loop, as long as you're able to play that counter blast, because you just ride, soul blast this out, and then during the end phase, you just rewrite it on top. So you just always will be able to pay for 1 soul. All right, so moving on into the main deck. Of course, we are actually going to be playing the 3 copies of Persona Ride. It's just kind of just mandatory, and especially in this deck, your Persona Ride is actually both searchable and to a certain degree recyclable. So you tend to see your Persona Ride pretty much every single turn past turn 4, which is actually really cool that you're kind of able to just do that. And then for our last grade 3 card, we are actually just playing the Caliburn here. This is just, you can either draw 2 cards or put it into the soul and countercharge 1. Mostly you use this for that countercharge, because this deck is pretty counterblast heavy, and though it does have a way to kind of sustain the counterblast it's using, a lot of the times you'll find yourself wanting just that 1 extra counterblast so that you can make an even stronger push, and Caliburn does definitely do that. But if you don't want to play this, there's definitely a plethora of other things that you could play. You could play, like, I don't know, if you want want to make this deck more tanky, you could go Twin Cast. You could definitely try out just like another Persona Ride with the Gradius, whatever you think works. Honestly, the deck doesn't use any orders, so this is really just a bit of a flex slot. So moving on into the grade 2s, we are actually going to be opting to play 2 more copies of the Verte from the ride line in the main deck, because as you saw with Rugina, we do actually need to have a bunch of Flamme-Glam named, and unfortunately the only ones that we have are the 4 from the ride line, as well as 1 more that we'll be talking about later. So the main rearguard skill is at the end of the battle she attacks. If your Vanguard is the grade 0 only, you can Soul Blast 1 and retire her to choose one of your opponent's rearguards and retire it. So actually having access to board control is pretty nice in a lot of different matchups, more than you would actually think, especially like if you think about Levy draws, you've got Foxel. If you think about what is it, Raziel, they have the Gabuelius, which is like, okay, they don't mind if you retire it, but you know, they're not exactly building a board for free until they swing with the Raziel, until they go into the battle phase. So it does kind of minimize their attack power. I do have a video of this deck against Raziel, so you can kind of see the power of this card in action in that video. But of course, the fact that, like I said before, it does cost Soul Blast 1 doesn't actually matter, because as long as you reride into the grade 0, you can only just Soul Blast out the grade 3 and retire her, and then during the end phase, you just reride whatever you Soul Blast it out. So the soul actually does not matter in the very bit. All right, so the next most important card, of course, is a new card that we actually did get in set 5, that being a new Flamme-Glam, a Flamme-Glam support guitar, Gradins. Okay, Gradine. But basically, when she is placed on rear, you can counterblast 1, and then you check the top cards of your deck equal to the number of Flamme-Glams you control, and then choose any card from among them and just add it to your hand, which is just kind of insane to think about. You can technically play this because it is generic, technically, where you counterblast 1, draw a card effectively. But of course, the other skill that is not as generic is that if you are on the grade 3 Flamme-Glam, do know it's just you. Your opponent doesn't actually have to be on grade 3. You EB2 and retire her in order to give yourself the skill that all your Flamme-Glams base power becomes 13k, which is super big, because if you create a column of, say, 2 Flamme-Glams, that is a 26k column swinging and a 10k Vanguard potentially. And then, of course, when you do reride into the Blue Crare, she becomes 13k base plus the extra 2k that she does get from the Regia skill for each card in the damage zone. So another way to make your columns just that much bigger. The one complaint I do have about her is she eats away at CB, which is something the deck does not really have extra access to, because of course you do need 1 CB every single turn for Rugia. So slowly eating away at your extra CB by using the first skill is not always the greatest play, especially if you don't have access to consistent counter charging with the deck. But you know, it's there, it's pretty good, so you might as well use it. And of course, the other thing that is kind of unfortunate is that you do have to retire her, and sometimes you only have these 2. Like if you have this card in hand and you have Regia's skill to call a second one, well, there's your 3 names, but that means you can't use her skill because, you know, you need to keep those 3 names on board, otherwise you have a vanilla Vanguard. All right, so moving on, we have just a little bit more support here, just some, you know, searching out of pieces. This is the, I don't know, I just call her the fan. She is, when she is placed, you check the top 3 cards of your deck, and then you can add any Flamme-Glam to your hand, and then the rest go to the bottom of the deck in any order. So bot decking triggers feels really bad, but the fact that this is a free on-place check top 3, add 1 is just kind of insane to think about. Like, this is a really good card. Obviously, I wish it were like more than top 3, but you know, it's free. What can you ask for? And then she does actually have another skill where if you're, as long as you're on a Flamme-Glam, doesn't matter if it's Regia or if it's a grade 2, she gets boost. So you don't even have to attack with her. You can keep your front row full of Flamme-Glams, which is great because, you know, you always want to be attacking with the Flamme-Glams, because we already discussed this is, as we already discussed, this is an after it attacks skill. And for our last grade 2, we're actually playing a little bit of bulk here. This pulls double duty as, you know, helping to recycle pieces, but also as being a very good shield. So when she's put on Guardian Circle, which of course means we guard with it from hand or you just intercept with it, which is probably not going to happen unless you're getting really desperate. But you put a Flamme-Glam to the bottom of the deck, and then she gets plus 10k shield. So she's a 15k guard. So basically you have 3 more triggers in your deck, and it is pretty important to recycle your pieces sometimes because you do only call from deck. You can't call from drop. So just having a way to put pieces back into the deck is very vital at times. All right, so getting into the grade 1s, we are actually maxing out on the remaining copies of the grade 1. The Hahuna, I guess. But anyways, the main skill that we're going to be talking about is that at the end of the battle, she attacked. If your Vanguard is the grade 0, you can retire her and countercharge 1. So this is our main form of countercharge. But unfortunately, this card is an example of what I like to call fake countercharge, which is to say that you can't countercharge with her without counterblasting first. So it's not a countercharge, it's just a refund. Unless you manage to get 2 of them in the front rows, which you might think is great, but then you realize that you need to have 1 more Flamme-Glam with a different name on board, and the only other Flamme-Glams other than grade 1 are more grade 2s, which, you know, they're not going to be in the back row because they're not doing anything back there. For that reason, I've considered putting in some copies of the grade 0 back into the main deck, just so that we have another boosting Flamme-Glam and we can actually create that double yellow line, or that double yellow front row, just so you can actually countercharge 1 for once. But I will say, if you play this deck correctly and you just pace yourself out throughout the game, you shouldn't be too wanted for counterblast, as long as you're using her skill every single turn, which, like, you know, you're supposed to be using her skill every single turn, which kind of gets annoying because, like, you have a grade 1 in the front row and maybe you'd want something more powerful. But don't forget, she can be buffed up to 13k base, and you do also have things like 10k boosters that are grade 2, so it's definitely not the end of the world. So moving on, we are going to be playing 4 more copies of effectively Flamme-Glams, which is the Eshma. So Eshma here is, like I said, she's basically just 4 more copies of any Flamme-Glam in your deck, because when she is placed on rear, you can EB4 to search your deck for a grade 2 or less card with Flamme-Glam, call it to rearguard circle, and then she gains an extra 5k until the end of turn. So effectively, the one bad thing about this card is that it's EB4. The reason they did that is because they let you call grade 2 or less, and they don't want you calling this on grade 1 and getting a free grade 2. So they put that little restriction there of EB4, but still very solid card for getting your Flamme-Glams out. As long as you open any combination of 1 Flamme-Glam or her, you basically have Rugia's skill online, because you can always use her skill to just call something. But then the other skill is also pretty important. By sliding her into the soul and bot decking a Flamme-Glam, you can give one of your units 5k. The 5k doesn't really matter that much. Like, yeah, I can help you push over some, you know, power thresholds, but for the most part, you're only using that skill to either, like, clear board space because you want to put something more powerful there, or to, you know, kind of just build up soul if you really need it. All right, so moving on, we do have a formerly pretty important card, but since I think it's not as good, that's going to be 3 copies of the Licorice. So she has a skill that when your Flamme-Glam Vanguard attacks, do note she doesn't actually have to boost that attack. You can counterblast 1 and choose a Flamme-Glam from your drop, put it to the bottom deck, and then you, the player, get the skill that all of your Flamme-Glams will gain 5k. So basically an extra 5k to your front row units, and if you happen to have, you know, one of her in the back row, it adds an extra 5k there too. So it spreads a lot of power around. Oh, you do also draw a card, which is something I always forget about. But the main reason I toned her down to 3 is because realistically, you only ever want to see one of them in a game. Usually what I do is I stick her behind the Vanguard. Honestly, that's just the best place for her to be, because she's not really that good at, you know, boosting attacks. She's just basically a vanilla that gives power. All right, and so to finish off our grade 1s, we are actually going to be playing 3 copies of the new double rare from set 5. So this card has a skill from the drop zone, which is when your Flamme-Glam gets retired by a card effect, you can remove her from the drop zone, bind her in order to choose that one of those cards that was retired, and just add it back to your hand. So now there's definitely like an argument to not play this. I can understand a lot of people being apprehensive about putting this into the deck because it really doesn't do a whole lot unless you discard it, which, you know, isn't that hard to do. You can always guard with it. Sometimes you do need an extra 5k shield and you don't want to get rid of any of your pieces. She's perfect for that situation. You know, riding up, as long as you get her into drop zone, it's really good. But the main reason that I did actually put her in is because I was noticing a pattern where I wouldn't be able to get to 2 Flamme-Glam names very effectively. Like maybe I wanted to keep recycling this and I didn't have enough pieces to put it back in deck. So being able to have this from the drop zone and just recur it whenever I do actually need that extra name is it just felt like pretty good, because basically what you do is you swing with these, you retire them for their skill to countercharge, and then you bind this, add that card back. So it's really good with that. The other niche situation that I do use her for is, like I said, the support. The main issue I have with this is that it gets itself off board, so you reduce your names. So if you do have these 2 cards, what you do is you call this, you use her skill, EB2, bind her, or not bind her, retire her, and then since she was retired by a card ability, you can just bind this, add this back, and now you have 3 names. It's not the greatest play, but you know, if you need to do it, it is there for you, just in case. And theoretically, she does also work against like removal matchups. If you leave any Flamme-Glams on board, which I don't know why you would, and they get retired, hey, you can always just bind this, add it back. All right, so let's go ahead and just finish off with, you know, the pleasantries. Of course, playing our 4 PGs. This would be Elementaria, but I just don't want to put it in this deck right now. Then, of course, for our trigger lineup, we are just playing the 4 and 8 crit. I am just playing effect crits. You don't really need to. Sometimes you need soul, although, like I said, you technically have an infinite soul glitch, so it doesn't really come up that much, especially now these days. We used to use a soul a lot more, but we've got things like the grade 1, so it's not really as necessary these days. But we are playing for our 3 of, we're opting to just play draw triggers. This deck is pretty tanky, and just being able to draw and see your pieces is also always pretty good. You could try out fronts in this deck because your attack patterns do definitely play into that, but you know, I just like having the extra draw. And then, of course, for heals, I am actually playing 2 copies of counter crit heals in this deck. My rationale for it was, this, like I said, this is a tanky deck and you want to pace out the game. So you don't really want to be taking big critical attacks. So just like having that lets you temp out a little bit better. Definitely, if you really want to, like I said, always say, this is up to preference. Play them, don't play them. Do your own thing. And of course, for our overtrigger, we are just playing the blue overtrigger. You know, having that extra crit is really good. Adding back pieces is always really good, and especially in a combo-based deck like this. All right, so instead of doing a quick test hand, what we're actually going to do is we're just going to run through some of the combos that you could potentially do here. So we're going to go ahead and get it started off with, we're pretending we just rode into our grade 3 here. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and call this, and we're going to use its skill to EB4 in order to superior call. It doesn't really matter. We can go ahead and call that. Then we're going to use the skill of the Regina, Soul Blasting the 1, and we're going to go ahead and just call out our other Flamme-Glam. So now we do have the 3 names here. So what we can do is we have one of these in hand, we can go ahead and call it. We can counterblast 1, check the top 1, 2, 3, 4, and then just add anything to our hand. Then we do actually have to EB2 in order to, well, we don't have to, but we want to go ahead and do that and make all these 13k base. So we're gonna go ahead and just, our last card is gonna call this. Maybe we check the top cards of the deck and we add another copy of this. So what we would do here is swing it in at the Vanguard. I'm going to go ahead and just swing boosted. I usually get swing boosted with the first attack because a lot of the times the second attack does tend to have a little bit more oomph in it. So what we could do here is we can't actually use Licorice's skill because we do need to counterblast 1 for this. So we're going to do our drive checks, and at the end of the battle, we're going to counterblast 1 in order to re-ride into the grade 0. So in this instance, we do have a couple of options here. Now, I'm not entirely sure what is the correct play, but you do have the option. You can either swing with this first, or you can swing with your Vanguard first. So obviously, swinging with Vanguard first does put a lot of pressure. It lets you spread trigger power to the remaining rear guards. But the benefit of actually swinging with the yellow first is that you can use her skill to retire her and then countercharge one. And then when you swing in with your Vanguard again, you can counterblast one, put the yellow back onto the bottom of the deck, draw another card, and then give 5k to your last remaining swings. You do lose out on the 5k here, but you're able to actually get a little bit more pressure on your Vanguard, a little bit more pressure on your other column that is swinging for still actually pretty big. This is like 18k base, thanks to the other skill and this, and then plus another 8k, so that's 26 in at the Vanguard. And then of course we would use this skill, Soul Blasting out, making sure we Soul Blast out the Rogia, so that during the end phase we would Superior Ride it from the drop zone. All right, and so the other play I do want to show you guys is the Insane High Turn 2 High Roll, which I wouldn't count on because it doesn't actually happen that often. But basically what it is, when you ride to grade 2, you can go ahead and call out a column if you would like. And then what you can do is you can call this, assuming you have a Flamme-Glam. You have to open up basically this, a Flamme-Glam, and then maybe one of these, calling it, counterblasting 4, checking top 4 again, and then call like this, then maybe search again. So what would this Insane High Roll would be swinging in at the Vanguard for 18, using the skill to counterblast 1, bot deck a Flamme-Glam, and then draw another card, and then you basically add 5k to your entire column, so this becomes a 25k column, and this goes from a 14 to a 24k column, so you're hitting well over defensive with this play. But like I said, this is like a 3-card combo. It doesn't really happen that often because you need Licorice, you would probably need something else to call here, probably another Flamme-Glam, and you also need another Flamme-Glam to discard because you do have to put something back for this skill. All right, so that's gonna do it for my Flamme-Glam deck profile. Hope you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to do all those YouTube things, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.